Okay, so today we are going to continue with looking at quadratics, and we are going to continue graphing quadratics, and now we are actually going to start analyzing the graphs of those quadratics just a little bit. And what we have here on the first slide is a list of the things that we need to be able to look at a graph or look at an equation and be able to figure out about our graph and of our quadratic. So the first thing, first of all, we will be in vertex form, so we are going to be in the form y equals a times x minus h squared plus k. So we're going to be in that form, and if we are not, kind of like we did yesterday, we will put it into vertex form by completing the square. So the first thing we need to remember is that the vertex is easy to find when we're in vertex form. It's just at hk. That axis of symmetry is just the vertical line through the vertex of the parabola. And so those are two things that we've already done. And then as you start looking down our list, the rest of these things are things that you probably maybe have heard of before, but we are going to take a deeper look at with what we're going to do today. Okay, so if you notice as you go down the list here, is that we are going to write domain, range, when it is increasing and when it is decreasing is all going to be written in what's called interval notation. And that's just a different way of writing things that would be like an inequality. Okay, so if we have something like, say we have the inequality y is less than 3. We could write that in interval notation as we are thinking of all of the values that are less than 3. Well, if we're thinking about that, there's an infinite number of numbers less than 3. So if we were going to write it in interval notation, we would put like a parentheses, okay? And since there's an infinite number of numbers less than 3, we would say that our interval goes from negative infinity. That's an infinity sign, and since we're talking about going to the left, we're talking about negative infinity, and it would go all the way to 3. Okay, so y is less than 3 would mean that any of those numbers there's an infinite number of numbers less than 3, and then that's a comma there, okay, and then all the way up to but not including 3 because it's less than. So if we are not including 3, we would put a closed parentheses on the other side. Whereas if we had y is less than or equal to 3, it would look a little bit different. We would still be talking about that infinite amount of values that's less than 3. So we would still have from negative infinity to 3, but this time it's or equal to 3, which means it's going to look a little bit different. And to include 3, we put a square bracket on the end of it. Okay, so that are two different ways to write it. And then let's say we wanted to write that y is greater than 4. Okay, so to do that, we're thinking, all right, I know that I'm talking about all of the numbers greater than 4. Again, there's an infinite amount of numbers greater than 4. We could list them and list them and list them forever and ever. If we want to write it in interval notation, that means that we are starting at 4 and thinking about all of those numbers bigger than that. So it'd be 4, and we are going all the way to positive infinity. Whereas if we went y is greater than or equal to 4, we are going to start at 4, but we are or equal to, which means we are going to include 4 with a bracket, and we are saying there's an infinite amount of numbers greater than 4. So as we start doing these, we're going to use we are going to use interval notation to describe the graphs. So when we'll come back to that a little bit later. Okay, the domain, this should be kind of a term you remember from Algebra 1. Domain is all the possible values for x. And I like to think of domain when we think of x. It's basically like how it's left and right. It's how wide the graph is, as opposed to the range, which is all the values of y, which is like how tall the graph is, which part of it goes up and down. The max is basically what's the highest point on your parabola. And then the min, what's the minimum point or the lowest point on your parabola. And when we have a parabola, it's either going to have a maximum or a minimum. It is not going to have both with a parabola. And then we are also going to use interval notation when we're describing when the graph is increasing or going up from left to right. And then also using interval notation to describe when it is going down or decreasing from left to right. So let's take a look at what all of these things together are actually going to look like with a graph. 0. Ooh. Okay, so what we have here on the first one is we have vertex form. Okay, I know it's in vertex form just by looking at it, and I can tell right away what my vertex is. So my vertex, remember, is HK, so it's at 3, 2. So my vertex is at 3, 2. It's an ordered pair, so I'm going to have parentheses with it. So I'm going to go down to my graph down here, and I'm going to plot my vertex at 1, 2, 3. Okay, so there is my vertex at 3, 2. I'm going to label it. Okay, next I have my axis of symmetry. Remember, that's just the vertical line that goes through my vertex. So my x value of my vertex is also the x value of my axis of symmetry. So my vertical line is at x equals 3. So let's go down here and go ahead and graph x equals 3 going right through there. Okay, so those are all things we've done before. The y-intercept, we need to actually sketch the graph. So our y-intercept is we're going to put 0 in for x. So I would have negative 0 minus 3 squared plus 2. Negative 3 squared is 9. That negative is on the outside. Negative 9 plus 2 is negative 7. So I'm at 0, negative 7, my ordered pair. Let's go down here and finish up our graph. So I'm at 0, negative 7. Got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then I just need to reflect that point across my axis of symmetry. And then I'm going to sketch my graph. And I know I did it correctly because it has that negative out in front, which means it should be reflected down instead of opening up. All right, so now we get to the part that's going to be a little bit different. We have already done that part several times in the last several days. So we need to think about the domain, okay? And the domain of a parabola, as long as it doesn't have endpoints, the domain is basically how wide that graph could get. And when we have these arrows on the end down here, that indicates that it's going on and on to infinity in both directions. So when we're talking about how wide it could possibly get, we could have any value of x all the way from negative 1,000 to positive 1,000 and still have it be somewhere on our graph. So our domain is going to be from negative infinity to positive infinity. In Algebra 1, you might have called this all real numbers, or sometimes if you use the notation for it, it looks like that. But when we do it in interval notation, we are going to say that all real numbers means that we are going from negative infinity to positive infinity. Okay, and with infinity, anytime there's really no end to it, so we always use the parentheses or the soft curves on there, not the brackets. Okay, so let's look at our range. Okay, our range is with our y values, and as I'm looking, I notice that my entire graph is below 2. Okay, my vertex was at 3, 2. I'll put that up here again so you can see that was my vertex was at 3, 2. My entire graph is below or less than 2. Okay, which means when I'm going to go and write my inequality here, it includes 2 because it comes all the way up to 2 before it turns around and comes back down. So it's everything is less than or equal to 2. And again, it's 2 because my y value of my vertex is 2 and everything is below 2. So if I am going to write that in interval notation, okay, I'm thinking what values are less than 2? There are an infinite number of numbers that are less than 2. So I'm going to have from negative infinity, and I'm going to go all the way to 2, and I'm going to include 2, so I'm going to put that hard bracket on it. Okay, so then as I move on, thinking max or min. Okay, well, my parabola has a high point, right? It has the highest point, so it's going to have a maximum at, and where was my highest point at? My highest point was at 2, so my highest point was at y equals 2. And then we got to think about increasing and decreasing. So if I'm looking at my graph and I'm reading my graph from left to right. So I'm going to start over here on my graph and I'm just going to follow the line. So if you notice, if I read from left to right, my blue that I have right now is increasing until it gets to 3. Okay, I'm going to put that in a different color. It's increasing until I get to 3, and then it starts to decrease. So it is increasing all the way to 3. So it's increasing from negative infinity, this is negative infinity here, and it's increasing, increasing, increasing until it gets to 3. So to write that in interval notation, it's increasing from negative infinity all the way to 3, and at 3 it's not increasing or decreasing. That's like a stopping point. So we put that soft parentheses on the outside. And then it turns and it is decreasing from 3. So we're going to have that as our starting point. And then it's decreasing, 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 and it never stops decreasing. So it's decreasing all the way through positive infinity. Oops. Sorry. Okay, so let's go ahead and keep looking here. We are going to do the exact same thing, except this time it's not in vertex form. You're going to have to put it into vertex form. So this is what you did yesterday, where you remember you squared it up, you took half of b and squared it up, and you added and subtracted the same thing. So what I'd like for you to do right now is to pause the video, put it into standard form, or excuse me, it's already in standard form, put it into vertex form, and then we can move on. Okay, so I hope you took a minute there and put it into vertex form, and here we have it, and this is where we are going to be working from. We have y equals x plus 1 squared plus 0. So let's go ahead, and now that we have it in vertex form, let's do that simple stuff that we already know how to do. Our vertex is going to be at negative 1, 0. And our axis of symmetry is at x equals negative 1. And then our y-intercept, we'll go ahead and put these on the graph here in a second. Our y-intercept is when we plug in 0 for x, so we would have y equals 0 plus 1 squared plus 0. So we would be at 0, 1. So our y-intercept is 0, 1. So let's go ahead and go down here. And our vertex is at negative 1, 0, which is here. Our y-intercept, or actually our axis of symmetry, is that vertical line that goes through there. Our y-intercept was at 0, 1? At 0, 1. And then I reflect across, and then I'm just going to graph my parabola. Okay, so those are all the things that we have already done. So now let's start talking about domain and range. Remember, the domain is all of your possible x values. And most of the time, for right now, as long as there are arrows on both ends of your parabola, it's going to be all real numbers, which means in interval notation, all real numbers can be written as negative infinity to positive infinity. And when you do your class kick with this, it does not have the infinity symbol available. So when you have to put it into your class kick, you're going to have to go with negative INF, comma positive INF, like that. That's the same thing, and that's how you actually have to enter it into your class kick. Okay, so your domain is negative infinity to positive infinity. Your range, if we look at it, everything is above this line right here. Everything is above, and this ordered pair here was negative 1, 0. That was our vertex. So our vertex was at negative 1, 0, which is what we had up there. So everything in the graph, all of the red parabola of the graph, is above 0. Okay, remember your range deals with your y value, so everything in your range is going to be above or equal to, is going to be greater than or equal to 0. So let's think about what that means. That means that I'm going to have a starting point of 0 and everything greater than that, and there's an infinite amount of values greater than that. So we would put 0, infinity. And that 0 has a bracket, not a parentheses, because it includes 0. And if we look at it, it has a minimum value. It's got a low point, which means we're going to have a minimum at y equals 0. Okay, it's our that kind of that horizontal line that's the breaking point. It's at y equals 0. And then we are increasing. Well, if we read it from left to right, okay, let's look at our graph. If we read it from left to right, we are going, if you follow my highlight here, we are going down, which means on this side we are decreasing, and on the other side we start to go up and we are increasing. Okay, and our increasing and decreasing goes back to our x value, which is -1, because that -1 is what splits it in half. Okay, so it is increasing over to our right over here, which means it starts increasing at -1. And remember, it's a parentheses, not a bracket, because it does not include -1. And then it just keeps on increasing all the way to infinity. It is decreasing, right? It starts all the way up here. Somewhere, we could start anywhere in negative infinity. It's decreasing all the way until it gets to -1. So it is decreasing from negative infinity all the way to -1. And again, we put the parentheses, not the bracket, because it goes to -1 but does not include it, because that -1 is neither increasing nor decreasing. Okay, last one. We are going to do the exact same thing here with, I gave you an equation in standard form. I would like for you to pause the video and put it into vertex form, and then we'll go through the rest of the information. Okay, I hope you were able to get it into vertex form correctly. And now that we're in vertex form, let's just go through our information here. So our vertex is at 1, 1. We can see that right from our form. And our axis of symmetry is at x equals 1. Our y-intercept, if we put 0 in for x, 3 times 0 minus 1 squared plus 1, we get 3 times 1 is 3 plus 1 is 4. So we are at 0, 4. And I want you to go ahead and graph that. Pause the video. I want you to try to go through the rest of this and see if you can figure out the domain, the range, max, min, increasing and decreasing, and then go ahead and check it with what I have. Okay, so take a look at what you have, and if you have any questions on any of these things about how we got these answers or anything, please raise your hand and let me know, and I would be more than happy to go over it with you one more time. Good luck. And the rest of the class kick is going, there are, I believe, 4 questions in class kick where you're going to be asked to do this same basic thing. And remember, when you do it in class kick, if you're talking about infinity, you use INF if you're going to positive infinity, and you use negative INF if you are talking about negative infinity.